Have you noticed there are a lot more queer characters in the media these days? Even compared to just 10 years ago, I can point to many more examples of prominent, visible, and authentic portrayals of LGBT people. Gone are the days of Disney queer coding and closet Dumbledores. Oh, I guess we've not come that far. But still, statistics collected by Nielsen and GLAAD suggest the percentage of queer-inclusive media is at a record high, which has prompted some to wonder, how much do we actually need? The theory runs something like this. X% of people are LGBTQIA+, therefore, X% of the media should feature LGBTQIA+ representation, and no more than that. This theory is, technically speaking, utter horse. Yet it is irritatingly persistent. Most often, it's used by people trying to argue that queer people are, in fact, overrepresented. These people often disagree on how much the correct percentage ought to be, but they're certain it's already too much. It's hard not to see this as a thinly veiled attempt to dismiss the complaints of minorities. A lot of similar arguments were trotted out about POC representation in direct response to the #OscarsSoWhite year. But what's even more troubling is, recently, I've seen the same theory being used by advocates for representation, citing a population statistic as if it's the goal. I can agree it may be politically useful to use our enemies' logic against them, but I think it's dangerous to start taking this idea for granted. That's gonna come back to bite us in the ass. For the purposes of this video, I'll call this proportional diversity. The idea that diversity in media should be proportional to diversity in real life. On the face of it, that might not seem like a bad idea. Demographic statistics can be a useful metric for representation in other areas, hiring practices for instance. And if art is meant to hold up a mirror to the world, surely it's better for that reflection to be accurate. Queer people are a minority. We may not like it, but the numbers don't lie. And, okay, sure. But let's take a closer look at those numbers. The statistic most commonly cited in these arguments is from GLAAD's Studio Responsibility Index. Since 2013, GLAAD has collated a yearly report in which it examines all major Hollywood films of the preceding year and tallies up various statistics on representation, including the percentage of films which feature any kind of LGBTQ characters. Since 2017, this figure has gradually climbed past the 20% mark, which is more than even the most generous estimates for the percentage of LGBTQ people in the world population. Even accounting for the reduced number of releases in 2020, this statistic suggests LGBTQ characters are represented pretty well, actually. However, this is just one statistic in the reports. It tells us nothing about the quality of representation. A story featuring an openly queer leading character counts just the same as a stray shot that can be cut for the international market. GLAAD observes even when queer characters do appear, around half do so for less than 10, 3, or even just 1 minute of screen time. Even films that do feature queer characters prominently aren't necessarily positive examples of representation. Plus, not all identities are represented equally, skewing heavily towards white, gay, male characters. Queer women, bisexual people, and queer people of colour feature much less frequently. Transgender and non-binary characters haven't appeared at all for the last 4 reports, and they have no figures on asexual characters. All of which is to say nothing about the types of films queer characters appear in. We are much more likely to be a tragic figure in a hard-hitting drama, or the wisecracking comic relief in a rom-com, than we are to be action heroes who save the day, or even acknowledged to exist in front of children. But this is just mainstream cinema. Though GLAAD highlights a few notable examples, they don't include independent films in their statistics. It also overlooks television, which GLAAD does a separate report on, but because it works differently, the numbers are difficult to combine. What's more, the reports only cover new releases. What about old films on Netflix, reruns on TV, classic books on school syllabuses, Shakespeare at the theatre? These are just as much a part of the media. But I've no idea how you'd go about factoring that into the percentage. And quite aside from any of this, GLAAD's percentage counts films, whereas population statistics count individuals. Even if the percentages match, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. You'd have to tally up every single character across all fiction ever to even approach a figure that might actually be useful to compare. And it's not like population statistics are straightforward either. The point is, representation is too complicated to be summed up in just one statistic. Sure, it might give you an impression, or at least indicate how things are changing over time, but you can't assume representation is fine, actually, just because one number is where you think it should be. Okay, but that's just the maths. For the sake of argument, let's imagine we could come up with a reliable figure which accounts for all of this. If that were possible, surely a number like 20% would be too much. We'd be more likely to encounter queer people in the media than we would in real life. Isn't that just unrealistic? Except, whoever said fiction needs to be realistic? We tell stories about magic and outer space and mythical beings. Witches, androids, and vampires make up 0% of the population, but nobody calls this overrepresentation. In all seriousness, we do like fiction to be authentic to real life, but holding up a mirror to reality doesn't always mean reflecting things accurately, uniformly, or even in their entirety. Certain topics are more relevant to the conversation, certain topics require more attention, certain topics need to be handled in a certain way, and if certain topics take up a disproportionate amount of screen time, that may be as it should be. Let's say straight cisgendered people outnumber queer people at about 9 times to 1, roughly speaking. Proportional diversity takes that to mean there are about 9 times as many stories about straight people as there are about queer people, which isn't necessarily true. Now, I don't doubt there are countless valuable stories about straight people, but being a majority means there's more crossovers of experience. One straight story will probably represent a fair few straight people, whereas the lgbtqia+ keeps adding letters to its acronym in a bid to include all the identities within our community. It's a broad range of experiences, and all of them deserve to be represented. However, strict adherence to proportional diversity means all but the most common experiences get simplified, amalgamated, or averaged out entirely. It also assumes all stories are proportional in scale. Stories may be about a handful of characters, or they may be about entire worlds of people, societies, communities, families, neighborhoods, slices of humanity. Sometimes, representation is a matter of where you cut that slice, and who you cut out. I'm not talking about straightwashing here, although I'm not talking about it. This is when queerness is downplayed or erased through the process of adaptation, be it of a historical figure who was queer in real life, or a fictional character who was queer in the source material. Taking a story and removing the queerness from it is obvious homophobia, and, to paraphrase Out magazine, cultural theft. But in addition to this, the absence of queerness can also be felt when a story aims to represent a group of people and chooses, whether consciously or not, to exclude queer people from the group. Take a sci-fi show about a utopian spacefaring future that goes 50 years without a single openly queer character. What does that imply about this vision of utopia? Or take 8 seasons of a show set in San Francisco, the gay capital of the US, where none of the characters ever even meet a gay person. It's not only unlikely, it omits an important facet of the city's cultural identity. Or take a sprawling film franchise with thousands of characters and a whole pantheon of superheroes, yet it goes 7 years without featuring any queer people, and 13 years before it lets a queer superhero lead a film. It aspires to portray an entire universe, but is hesitant to let queer people be part of it. Or take ensemble casts which use diversity to represent a cross-section of humanity, mixing genders, races, and ages, but not queer identities. If the aim is to represent a wide range of perspectives, it's conspicuous when queer ones are left out. I'm not suggesting queerness needs to be present in every story. No story can represent the full breadth of human experience. No story is obliged to. But there comes a point where the omission of queerness starts to look like a choice. And I know some of these examples were products of their time, or they're progressive in other ways, or they're working to improve, and sure, fine, whatever. I'm just saying, a story can erase queerness in and of itself. Proportional diversity would be satisfied simply by putting out one queer story for every 9 straight ones, and they'd call that accurate to real life. But if those 9 omit queerness in places we'd expect to see it, that doesn't imply it's just off-screen somewhere. That's portraying a world in which queerness doesn't exist, which is not accurate. You can't just look at the big picture and put an OK stamp on it when the numbers line up. Nobody experiences the media in its entirety. We experience it as stories. It's on that level where representation matters. And that's all well and good, but when it comes down to it, show business is a business. It's led by market forces. The simple truth is, minority audiences are, by definition, smaller. It's just good business sense to scale your output to the size of the market. Well, that argument might make sense for, say, a factory, which makes, hats. You naturally make more hats for more common head sizes. However, lesser-known fact, media and hats are different. A hat can only be sold to one person, whereas outside of distribution logistics, the same piece of media can be enjoyed by as many people as choose to enjoy it. If a studio makes one straight film and one queer film, that's 50% of their output, but everybody still has something to watch on Friday night. Each individual product doesn't necessarily cater to an equal share of the overall market, nor do they need to. And if we're really talking turkey, recent successes suggest the market is actually quite hungry for queer content. It's that which will determine the market share, not demographics. Perhaps the worst assumption proportional diversity makes is that representation is a zero-sum game, as if this percentage is the middle of a tug of war. If queer people get 20%, that means straight people have been pulled down to 80. And man, what I wouldn't give for 80.
Luxury.
But again, it's bad maths. It overlooks the fact most stories with queer rep also feature straight people. The inclusion of one does not necessarily mean the exclusion of the other. And while I think it would be good, actually, to have more exclusively queer stories, it's foolish to assume we can't share. We already do. The whole idea that media is divided into straight stories and queer stories is incredibly reductive. Only in marketing do audiences fit into neat, separate boxes. In reality, nobody belongs to just one demographic, and no story is about just one thing. A story which appeals to queer people can appeal to other people just as much. Moonlight is unapologetically a story about being gay, yet it performed better than most independent films, finding an audience beyond just gay people. Because it's also about being black, about being male, about growing up, about finding your identity. In audience Q&As, director Barry Jenkins was surprised at the diversity of people who described the film as relatable. It just goes to show, you don't have to be queer to identify with a queer story. As film critic Chris Knight said in his review of Moonlight, to connect with a broad audience, make your story about a specific person. Because individuality is, ironically, the one thing we all have in common. What's more, you don't even have to identify with a queer story to find something valuable in it. Sure, relatability is a very potent way we connect with fiction. Obviously, I know how important it is to feel represented. But it's not the only way to engage with a story. It can be fascinating to step into the shoes of somebody unlike ourselves. Sometimes, what makes a story compelling is that it offers an insight into lives very different from our own. That's the great power of fiction. Diversity in the media benefits everybody. Obviously, queer rep benefits queer people most of all, but it benefits straight people too. More diversity means we see more, we learn more, we gain a greater understanding of our world and the people in it. The more voices we let speak, the more interesting the conversation is.
Because diversity is strength. Difference is a teacher. Fear difference, you learn nothing.
When people argue there's more than enough queer representation, I find it very telling. If they were truly concerned about straight voices being marginalized, they'd be doing the same thing we've been doing, pushing for more representation of ourselves. Instead, they push for less representation of others. It's just homophobia, pure and simple. Proportional diversity is effective rhetoric because it's hard to argue with numbers. But representation is not an equation to be solved. As Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, I'm sometimes asked, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And I say, when there are 9. People are shocked. But there'd been 9 men, and nobody's ever raised a question about that. It's not about achieving a certain percentage. It's about making that percentage stop mattering. When queer representation is no longer noteworthy. When queer inclusion is so naturally assumed, nobody feels the need to count anymore. When even if we did put queer rep in every story, nobody would bat an eyelid, because we have just as much right to be there as anyone else. So when people insist queer people are already represented enough, all that tells me is we still have a ways to go. This video was supported by my patrons. If you'd also like to support the channel, you can join at patreon.com/JamesWoodall, or you can donate via Ko-fi at kofi.com/JamesWoodall. You can also follow me on Twitter at JamesBWoodall, or simply like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy Pride.